I grew up in a home where my mother treated me not as her daughter, but as nothing more than a servant, someone to be ordered around and forced to perform menial tasks every single day. I was burdened with chores that left me little time for play or proper self-care. The reason for this harsh treatment was something I discovered only later in life. I bore a striking resemblance to my biological father. This resemblance, as cruel as it sounds, became the fulcrum of my mother's relentless disdain. And if you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share to support my channel. Your support means the world to me. My life was a constant struggle, defined by a painful punishment I had to endure simply because I looked like the man who fathered me biologically. A man who, in a twist of fate, ended up leaving me a substantial inheritance. Despite the fact that he provided me with this valuable gift, my mother, who had made my childhood a living hell, still demanded her cut of it. I, a 21-year-old woman, found myself bearing the heaviest burden simply for resembling my biological dad, a consequence of my mother's long-forgotten affair. My mom had been married to my stepfather for a decade, and during that time, she bore 3 daughters, Mindy, who was 26, Cece, age 24, and me at 21. The irony was that my stepfather, who never suspected a thing about my true origins, was completely unaware that I wasn't his biological child. As I grew older, my features began to change and increasingly mirrored those of my biological father, and this sparked suspicions in my stepfather's mind about my true paternity. My older half-sisters had always looked like our mother, and because of that, their origins were never questioned. But when I started to exhibit features that bore an uncanny similarity to my bio-dad, my stepfather decided to have a paternity test run on all 3 of us. The results were earth-shattering. My mother's infidelity was exposed. It turned out that only the eldest daughter, Mindy, was truly his daughter, while Cece and I did not share his DNA. My mother, cornered by the evidence, then confessed that the biological fathers of all 3 children were, in fact, 3 completely different men. Following this devastating revelation, my stepfather promptly filed for divorce. He chose to support only Mindy financially, the only daughter he believed was truly his, leaving Cece and me without his backing. In the aftermath, my mother was forced to work tirelessly, yet she displayed an extraordinary duality in her affections. She loved Mindy and Cece without condition simply because they looked like her, but I was always the outcast, the scapegoat who had, as a child, inadvertently exposed her darkest secret. I never experienced a moment of genuine maternal warmth from her. There was never even a fleeting instance of joy or tenderness in our interactions. It wasn't until much later that I learned the grim truth behind her bitterness. Her enmity towards me stemmed from the fact that I resembled my biological father, a constant reminder of her indiscretions and betrayals. The consequences of this truth were profound and deeply unsettling. Learning that I was the catalyst for my mother's disdain left me with a crippling identity crisis and an overwhelming sense of betrayal that nothing could ever repair. I found myself unable to even articulate a single complaint about the cold, indifferent treatment I received at home. According to my mother, the reason behind her harsh behavior was that Cece's father and my biological father had both shirked their responsibilities. Yet at least Cece bore a resemblance to our mother, a fact that somehow made it easier for her to provide for Cece. In stark contrast, my likeness to my bio-dad made me an object of perpetual resentment in her eyes. Every incident, every moment of my childhood was tainted by gaslighting and psychological abuse, as my mother and my half-sisters routinely twisted the narrative to blame me for every misfortune that befell our family. Mindy, in particular, embraced the label of a legitimate daughter, and would frequently hurl demeaning names at me, holding me responsible for our parents' marital breakdown. Even Cece, rather than offering me any solace, joined in the mockery, accusing me of being the very reason our family had been torn apart. I was constantly chastised for not resembling our mother. They would say that if only I had looked like her, perhaps our father wouldn't have abandoned us. It was as though my appearance was a choice I had made, an irrevocable characteristic that doomed me from the start. As a child, I internalized their relentless criticisms to the point where I came to despise every part of my appearance. I loathed my blue eyes that failed to match the warm brown ones of my mother, detested my nose and lips, and ultimately began to hate every aspect of my existence. The relentless indifference from my family extended into every corner of my life. I rarely received new clothes, often forced to wear what had once belonged to Mindy or Cece. My mother never bought me any toys, and I was forbidden from playing with the toys my half-sisters cherished. Instead, I was relegated to the role of an unpaid servant in my own home, fetching water, serving meals, washing dishes, doing laundry, and even making beds whenever needed. The sole redeeming act, if one could call it that, was that my mother insisted on sending me to a community school, ensuring that at least I received some form of education. At the tender age of 13, overwhelmed by the torment of my home life, I attempted to escape by running away. But my flight was short-lived. The police eventually found me and returned me to my mother's care. I pleaded with them, expressing my desire to remain away, but they were unyielding. My mother wept uncontrollably before the officers, insisting that she was a single mother juggling the care of 3 daughters, while I was merely a troubled child, envious of my sisters. I recounted all the emotional tortures I had endured, yet when the officers inquired whether I had suffered any physical abuse, I hesitated and said no. My words were recorded by the police, and my mother used the occasion to further paint me as nothing more than a jealous, troubled kid. Emotional abuse was not recognized as a crime then, and after offering me a perfunctory pat on the back and a plea to be a good kid, they left us to our fate. After that traumatic incident, the animosity within my home only intensified. My attempts to seek help by reporting the abusive environment to the police only deepened the resentment my half-sisters and mother held towards me. Life at home had become utterly unbearable, so I sought refuge in part-time jobs. I took on a variety of roles: babysitting for neighbors, mowing lawns, working at a video store, and many other gigs that allowed me to distance myself from the toxic atmosphere at home. Working outside provided a sense of independence and relief from the ceaseless free labor imposed upon me. As I began earning my own money, I grew increasingly rebellious, refusing to tolerate their bullshit. I stopped eating home-cooked meals and took charge of my own sustenance, and gradually life started to improve. I was finally able to purchase some of the things my sisters owned, and at times, I even managed to buy better clothing than they did. Cece's attitude softened a bit towards me as I grew more self-reliant. Though Mindy's jealousy and cruelty persisted, she would deliberately tear my dresses, destroy my makeup, and even hurl my belongings away out of spite, leaving me with no choice but to endure her malicious actions in silence. For a long time, I dreamed of saving enough money to escape this oppressive household entirely. However, fate had its own plans. My boss at the video store, noticing my determination, advised me to focus on finishing high school. He explained that completing my education would open the door to better job opportunities, mentioning that his son worked at a recruitment firm where he could potentially secure a promising sales position for me. Motivated by this glimmer of hope, I buckled down and dedicated myself to my studies. The day I graduated high school was both exhilarating and bittersweet. I packed my belongings and left home, determined to forge a new path. Soon after graduation, I landed a sales job, and my life began to take a turn for the better. Despite my newfound independence and success, my mother, clinging to the past, attempted to pull me back into the life she had always known. On several occasions, she showed up unannounced at my workplace, pleading for me to return home. Her argument was not driven by genuine maternal love, but by a twisted desire for financial gain. She insisted that instead of paying rent for a place of my own, I could simply contribute to the household expenses and live with them. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of her proposal. Living with them for free was a nightmare I had no interest in revisiting, and I certainly wasn't about to pay to be part of that toxic environment. One burning desire that I carried throughout these turbulent years was the need to meet my biological father, a man I had heard so little about, shielded from my life by my mother's relentless secrecy. I continuously pestered her for details, but she remained unyielding, steadfast in her refusal to divulge any information. When I finally confided in Cece, she recounted that our mother had told her own father did not want to be contacted, so it was best not to try. I, too, had been told the same dismissive tale. Suspicious that these stories were nothing more than carefully constructed lies, I pressed harder. Then, a couple of years ago, when my mother found herself in desperate financial straits after defaulting on her mortgage, she reached out to me, asking to borrow money. I struck a deal with her. I would lend the money if she finally revealed the identity of my biological father. Reluctantly, she whispered his name, offering no further details. I asked for his address, only to be told that he didn't want me in his life. Unwilling to accept this, I insisted that, until I was given all the information I needed, I wouldn't lend her a single penny. Eventually, she yielded and provided his address, a location so remote that it required a 30-hour road journey, or 2 connecting flights if I chose to fly. I saved up every penny, booked a flight, and finally arrived at the address, only to discover that it was the wrong one. In a fit of rage, I confronted my mother, threatening to report her for withholding my paternal details. She tried to guilt-trip me by suggesting that my desire to meet him was nothing short of an attempt to destroy her life, a claim that infuriated me even further. After an exhausting and heated confrontation, she eventually relented and provided me with his office address, located 4 hours away. But even then, she continued to warn me against the visit, insisting that my biological father did not want any contact with me, and that my presence would only cause him distress. Despite her desperate pleas, I boarded a bus and made my way to his workplace. The moment I finally met him was surreal beyond measure. There was no need for introductions. His eyes locked onto mine, and with a warm, familiar embrace, he pulled me into the tightest hug I had ever experienced from a family member. In that instant, a lifetime of loneliness and rejection seemed to melt away, replaced by a fleeting sense of belonging. I soon discovered a revelation that rocked my entire existence. My biological father had been sending child support for me all these years. My mother had deliberately misled both of us by providing false addresses, manipulating the truth to suit her own needs. She had even told him that I despised him and had no interest in meeting him. My biodad explained that he had been married for 40 years, had 2 grown sons whom he loved dearly, and that his family was unaware of my existence. He confessed that my mother had used his child support as a means of extortion, blackmailing him for money. Though he offered to support me, and even suggested that we could meet in private, he made it clear that he did not want to disrupt his family's life. The thought of being accepted only under secretive conditions left me with a heavy heart, and I ultimately chose not to pursue any further relationship with him. Over time, he sent me several emails in a bid to reconnect, but I found myself unable to respond. About 6 months later, fate intervened again when he unexpectedly showed up at my workplace. With genuine remorse, he apologized for the years of separation and confessed his deep regret over the lies that had kept us apart. He even admitted that after our meeting, he could no longer bear the secrecy surrounding our relationship, and so he confessed everything to his wife and children. His grown sons, now independent, took the news in stride, but his wife was visibly shocked, and they all began seeking therapy together to process the revelations. In an attempt to make amends, he handed me a document, a deed that confirmed his gift of a mansion to me. It was his way of trying to rectify the wrongs of the past and secure a future for me, a future that I had never dared to dream of. I was completely overwhelmed by his gesture. I hadn't expected him to be so well off, nor had I ever considered blackmailing him for money, as my mother had done for over 2 decades. I poured out my heart, telling him of the pain and mistreatment I had suffered simply because I looked like him. He expressed his sorrow, explaining that he had been misled by my mother's version of events, and that he had no idea how deeply I was hurting. Although he offered to support me further, I couldn't bring myself to accept his help, feeling that I had grown too independent. In the months that followed, I kept the news of the mansion to myself, even as I contemplated returning to college, a dream I had nurtured for a long time, but was forced to delay due to financial constraints. With the mansion, I devised a plan to lease it out, using the rental income to fund my education. However, it wasn't long before my mother discovered that my bio-dad had gifted me a mansion. Furious and desperate for her share of what she believed was rightfully hers, she began chasing after me with legal threats, claiming that because she was my mother and had endured the hardships of a divorce because of me, she was entitled to a piece of the inheritance. I was completely baffled by her logic and confused by the intricacies of inheritance laws in the states, laws that I admittedly knew very little about. Lacking the funds to hire a lawyer, I turned to anyone who could offer guidance on this complex issue. I might sound naive, but I genuinely needed help to navigate this legal labyrinth. Update 1. It turns out that money really does have a strange way of shifting power dynamics. I soon learned, much to my relief, that my mother had no legal claim to a property that was a gift from my bio-dad. The next time she appeared at my doorstep demanding a share, I put my foot down. No more negotiations, no more concessions. When she threatened to sue me over this, I boldly challenged her to take her chances. In the ensuing confrontation, she could only scream and protest like a wounded lion, but ultimately, her threats amounted to nothing more than bluster. After that explosive encounter, there was a long, painful period of silence between us. I eventually lost contact with her entirely, though I still occasionally crossed paths with Cece. Interestingly, after my life took a turn for the better following my reunion with my bio-dad, Cece managed to confront our mother about revealing her own father's identity. Sadly, her father turned out to be a German man who had long since returned to his homeland. A man who had once been our neighbor when he rented a room from someone next door. In his youth, he had been a student who had gotten my mother pregnant, and when she demanded child support, he simply fled. Cece managed to track him down by email, and he eventually confessed everything. They remain in touch now, although Cece is heartbroken that she never received any tangible benefit from the revelation, leaving her to wonder if she truly desired her father's presence or if she'd simply hit the jackpot. Not long ago, I decided to enlist the help of a tenant-finding agency for my newly acquired mansion. However, 6 days back, I received a distressing call from the agency. They informed me that when a prospective tenant visited the mansion, they discovered 2 women living there who claimed to be the rightful owners. They had even forcefully chased out the actual tenants. Over the past month, the agent had said 2 to 3 potential tenants, yet mysteriously, every single one had vanished after viewing the property. When I requested photographic evidence, the images revealed to my shock that the intruders were none other than my mother and Mindy. Fueled by a surge of indignation, I immediately drove to the mansion, an hour away from my current home, without uttering a single word of explanation. Upon arrival, I began haphazardly throwing their belongings out, and despite their frantic attempts to stop me, pleading with desperate cries of, "Wait, we can explain!" I roared that I would hear no more of their squatting antics. The chaos did not go unnoticed. Soon, concerned neighbors called the police. Although I did not have the original house documents on me, the agent produced a copy for the officers, who then escorted the intruders from the property. However, the police advised that I install additional security, and when I inquired about obtaining a restraining order against them, they informed me that it would be difficult since neither my mother nor Mindy had any previous criminal records. They were simply causing a nuisance. I immediately called my bio-dad to report everything. Although I did not yet have the funds to secure the property, he took charge of the situation, promising to install more security cameras around the mansion. He even reassured me that he would find a reliable tenant soon, so that I wouldn't have to deal with such disturbances again. Despite the temporary resolution, I remained uncertain how long these squatter issues might persist, and I promised to update everyone if there were further developments. A short while later, life threw yet another curveball at me. 2 weeks after the previous incident, my mother and Mindy reappeared at my door, this time looking utterly dejected and homeless. They claimed that my mother had lost her job and had defaulted on rent payments for 2 consecutive months, resulting in them being forcibly evicted from their rented home. With nowhere else to go, they had resorted to taking refuge in the mansion. Their situation was dire. They had been shoveling from one place to another, and now, desperate and tearful, they begged me to allow them to stay in the mansion for a month until they could sort out their lives. I was utterly exhausted after a long day and had no inclination to accommodate their incessant demands. I curtly explained that my bio-dad was now managing the property, and I was completely detached from the familial drama. They then pleaded with me to speak directly with him, their voices growing more insistent. In a moment of unbearable frustration, I finally exploded. I reminded my mother, with all the anger I had pent up over the years, that she had raised me for 18 years, not as a cherished daughter, but as a mere housemaid. I recounted, with raw emotion and bitter clarity, how she had never bought me new clothes or even the simplest of things. Everything I owned had been secondhand from Mindy or Cece. I described how I had survived on leftover food while they feasted on the freshest meals, and how I had performed nearly all the household chores without so much as a shred of love or care. I reminded her of the times I fell ill, only to be met with cold indifference, except for the rare instance when her concern surfaced solely as a reluctant act of providing over-the-counter medicine that once nearly cost me my life due to an allergic reaction. I screamed at her, blaming her for my suffering and for the fact that I was burdened with the physical traits of my biological father, a constant reminder of her own betrayal. My outburst was so fierce that, although she and Mindy eventually tried to console me after my tirade, I pushed them away, demanding that they leave and never darken my doorway again. The intensity of my anger left me so drained that I spent the following day feeling physically ill. I visited a doctor, took some medication, and allowed myself a few days of rest to recover from the emotional and physical toll of that confrontation. A couple of days later, still feeling lethargic and overwhelmed by boredom, I took my car for a drive around town. In a twist of fate, I passed by my mother's old residence and noticed that the house was locked, with some of her belongings scattered outside. Curious and concerned, I reached out to a neighbor friend to inquire about the situation. She revealed that my mother had once again found herself in trouble, this time caught in a scandal involving her landlord. Apparently, my mother had been engaging in an illicit relationship with her landlord, and when the landlord's wife discovered the affair, she confronted my mother violently, ultimately forcing her out of the house. It turned out that my mother had not been paying rent for over a year, relying on her scandalous liaison as a means to trade favors for shelter. In our small town, word travels fast, and soon everyone knew about her misdeeds. I hesitated to say this aloud because, despite everything, it was still my mother, but I couldn't help but think that her actions were as appalling as they were predictable. Not everyone is blessed with a picture-perfect family, and as I reflected on my own turbulent past, I realized that I had somehow managed to carve out a semblance of a life for myself. With my bio dad now handling the property management and the rental income from the mansion funding my college tuition, I had finally found a measure of stability. I may not have had a fancy college, but I was proud of the progress I had made and the life I had built on my own terms. Meanwhile, my mother continued to attempt manipulations. She even tried to seduce my bio dad, an act that ended with him chasing her off and threatening to call the cops if she ever dared to come near my mansion again. Since that final outburst, I haven't heard from her, and though Cece occasionally texts me, I know that Mindy has also abandoned her, having married a man from the next block, a widower with 2 kids, a big house, and some ancestral properties. It seems that, in a cruel twist of fate, my mother's traits have been passed on to Mindy. Now, turning to another turbulent chapter in my life, one that unfolds in a seemingly different realm, but is no less dramatic. I must share the story of my 14-year marriage that came crashing down when I caught my wife cheating with a mutual friend. My wife, a 38-year-old woman with whom I had shared 17 years of my life, 14 of those years in marriage, betrayed our trust in the most painful way imaginable. I was 47 at the time, and we had built our lives together in what I once thought was a picture-perfect relationship. When we first met, I was struck by her mature aura. She even believed I was younger than I really was, a notion that initially flattered me. We both dismissed the age difference as unimportant and plunged headfirst into a relationship that, at first glance, seemed to promise forever. Her family was enormous, a stark contrast to my own, which had always been relatively small and disconnected. I had long yearned for the warmth of a tight-knit family, and her family's open arms and constant support had been a significant factor in my decision to commit fully to our union. She, too, cherished her family dearly, and this mutual passion for familial bonds convinced me that I had found a partner for life. Together, we built a family of our own and were blessed with 2 boys, now aged 8 and 11. For a time, everything appeared to be going well. We shared memories, celebrated milestones, and embraced the joys of life as a united family. Even when challenges arose, we worked through them, and I poured my heart and soul into our relationship. I clung to hobbies like hunting, fishing, and golfing, though I knew that after our children were born, my priorities had to shift to putting my boys first. However, my wife's behavior began to change over time. She slowly transformed into a shallow, self-centered person who increasingly neglected not only our children, but also our marriage. I did everything I could to maintain the bond between us, even as her focus shifted away from the family that we had built together. The situation reached a breaking point on Memorial Day, a day that would forever be etched in my memory as the day everything began to crumble. As I was busy getting the boys ready for a holiday party, I happened to overhear my wife's muffled conversation in the bathroom. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood there quietly listening. I couldn't make out every word, but what I did hear was damning. My wife was on the phone professing her love for another man, expressing excitement at the prospect of being with him. Each word chipped away at the illusion of our marriage, and I felt as though pieces of my soul were being ripped away with every passing second. After her phone call ended, I waited until she emerged from the bathroom. When her shocked eyes met mine, she was visibly rattled. I didn't mince words. I asked her directly if she was cheating on me. Her response was stuttering and full of feeble excuses that fell flat in the silence of that tense moment. Without another word, I turned and left, knowing that I had to get on with preparing for the party for the sake of my boys. I made a deliberate decision to shield them from the bitter truth, ensuring that they would still enjoy their holiday, despite the unraveling of our family. Even though I attended the party with my children, I did so solely to preserve a facade of normalcy, all the while enduring an inner turmoil that threatened to overwhelm me. Later that evening, when my wife eventually returned home alone, opting to seek comfort from the man on her phone, I confronted her about what had happened. In a bizarre twist, she tried to justify her infidelity by accusing me of being inattentive and lacking passion. With a disturbing mix of flattery and condescension, she complimented me on being a trusting husband and a great provider, while simultaneously blaming me for her emotional disconnect. Her double-edged words were designed to soften the blow, but they only deepened my sense of betrayal. In that moment, I realized that our marriage was irreparably broken. I made the painful decision to file for divorce, a decision that loomed ever larger as the end of the year approached. Despite my resolve, my wife resisted, pleading that for the sake of our boys, we should remain together in a two-parent household. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the notion. I knew in my heart that staying in a loveless, toxic relationship for the sake of appearances would only hurt my children in the long run. I refused to subject them to a future where they would have to witness the crumbling of our marriage as a model for their own lives. In the aftermath of the affair, our mutual friends and family rallied around me, offering their unwavering support during this tumultuous time. The very people who once celebrated our union now saw through the facade my wife had constructed. Ironically, even her own family distanced themselves from her, while mine embraced me fully, an unexpected and healing silver lining amidst the chaos. Her paramour, a man I had once known and even socialized with, was now ostracized from her family gatherings. In stark contrast, my boys and I were welcomed with open arms at every family function. I even heard from several parents and acquaintances who commented on how my wife had only stayed long enough at events to snap a few pictures for social media, exposing her superficial need for validation. Despite the storm of emotions, I have slowly begun to reclaim my life. I continue to care for my boys with the love and dedication they deserve, and I have started rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of the failed marriage.